If the walls of our universe are made of information, they can be rewritten. The question is, who holds the compiler? We have traveled 3 paths now to the same conclusion. The Gnostics arrived through myth. The world is a construct built by an ignorant god, and something in us does not belong to it. Modern physics arrived through mathematics. Space-time may be emergent, perception is interface, and the solid dissolves into probability at close inspection. The simulation argument arrived through logic. If civilizations compute and survive, we are almost certainly inside a computation. 3 paths, 1 destination. The prison is real, but here is where paths diverge. Diagnosis is not cure. Recognizing the bars does not open the door. The Gnostics knew they were trapped. The physicists know space-time is emergent. The simulation theorists know the walls are computational. None of this, by itself, gets you out. The question that burns now is practical. What do we do with this knowledge? If the walls are information, can they be rewritten? If the prison is code, can it be hacked? If the Demiurge's laws are local ordinances rather than cosmic constitution, can they be appealed, circumvented, or exploited? Every system has vulnerabilities. It's a principle validated across domains. Security researchers call them exploits, weaknesses in the architecture that allow access beyond intended permissions. Sometimes it's a coding error. Sometimes it's a design flaw. Sometimes it's a feature that behaves unexpectedly under edge conditions. The Gnostics believed reality had exploits. They called them gnosis. Consider what we've established. Space-time, according to our most advanced physics, is not fundamental. It emerges from something deeper. Quantum entanglement perhaps, or information structures we don't yet have mathematics to describe. The amplituhedron calculates scattering amplitudes without assuming space-time exists. The holographic principle encodes 3-dimensional information on 2-dimensional boundaries. They are mathematical results. If space-time is emergent, then space-time has a code base. Not literally. I'm not claiming reality runs on C++ or Python. But functionally, there are underlying structures from which the rules we experience derive. Those underlying structures have properties. Those properties determine what's possible and what's impossible within the simulation. And here's the key. Impossible is always relative to a level. Within the simulation, faster than light travel is impossible. Relativity forbids it, but relativity is part of the simulation. It's a rule, not a necessity. At the level that generates space-time, the rule might not apply. The rule might be a parameter, adjustable, even exploitable by anyone with access to the right layer. This is what the phenomenon seems to be demonstrating. Craft that accelerate instantaneously, objects that transition seamlessly between media, physics violations that violate our physics, but might be perfectly consistent with deeper physics we don't yet understand. The phenomenon, if real, is proof of concept. Someone has access to the codebase. Someone knows how to modify the local rules. The question is whether we can learn to do the same. There's one element of reality that has always resisted the architecture. One thing that doesn't fit neatly into the Demiurge's construction. One anomaly that materialist frameworks have never successfully absorbed. Consciousness. The hard problem remains hard. No amount of neural mapping explains why there is something it is like to be you. Correlations exist between brain states and mental states, but correlation is not explanation. We can describe the neural correlates of seeing red without ever touching the redness, the felt quality that constitutes the experience. This is not a gap in our current knowledge. It's a structural mismatch between the thing being explained and the explanatory framework. Physical descriptions are third person, objective, from the outside, mathematical. Experience, though, is first person, subjective, from the inside, and qualitative. The gap is not empirical, it's categorical. The pneuma, the divine spark, was precisely that which didn't belong to the Demiurge's creation. It came from somewhere else. It was trapped in matter, but not made of matter. It was the one thing the prison couldn't fully contain, because it preceded the prison. Translate this into the computational frame. Consciousness might be the one thing not fully generated by the simulation. It might be a thread that runs through from the outside. It might be a backdoor that the system never intended to create, but couldn't avoid creating. Because consciousness is somehow fundamental in a way the simulation substrate is not. If consciousness is fundamental, if, as Hoffman and the panpsychists suggest, experience is the primitive from which matter emerges, rather than vice versa, then consciousness is not in the simulation the way objects are in the simulation. Consciousness is the viewing window. Consciousness is the player, not the avatar. Consciousness is that which was always already outside, experiencing the inside. The Gnostic Passwords, the ascent rituals, the claim that knowledge itself could liberate. All of this makes sense if consciousness is the back door. The way out is not through the physics of the prison. The way out is through the consciousness that was never entirely imprisoned. Wake up, and the walls reveal themselves as projections on a screen you were always watching rather than trapped inside. Throughout history, humans have developed methods that claim to access something beyond ordinary experience. Some are ancient, some are modern. Some are chemical, some are purely attentional. What they share is a claim. The default state of consciousness is not the only state. The prison has viewing angles. There are vantage points from which the bars become visible as bars, from which the walls reveal themselves as walls, from which the possibility of outside becomes experientially real rather than merely theoretical. Let's examine these methods with Gnostic eyes. The Gnostics developed sophisticated practices for navigating the cosmic architecture. Central among these were the sacred names, secret knowledge that the ascending soul could use to pass the archontic gatekeepers. This sounds like superstition, names don't have magical power. Saying the right syllables doesn't make physical barriers disappear. But consider what's actually being claimed. The archons in Gnostic cosmology are not just external entities. They are psychological structures, patterns of emotional bondage that keep consciousness attached to the Demiurge's world. The 7 archons correspond to the 7 planetary passions: lust, greed, pride, anger, melancholy, fickleness, and despair. These are not merely sins to be avoided. They are programs running in the soul, binding it to material existence through identification with desire. The passwords are not magical syllables. They are recognitions. Quote unquote, "I know who I am," is the fundamental password. To know who you are, not the body, not the story, not the personality, but the spark that precedes all these, is to break the archon's hold. The archon of lust has no power over someone who recognizes that the desire is a program, not the self. The archon of despair has no grip on someone who knows they are not the one despairing, but the one watching despair arise. This is phenomenologically precise. Modern psychology would call it disidentification, the capacity to observe a mental state without being absorbed in it. Meditation traditions call it witness consciousness. The cognitive behavioral tradition calls it metacognition, thinking about thinking. The Gnostic Passwords are technologies of disidentification, dressed in mythological language. They work not by magic but by shifting the location from which consciousness operates. And here's the radical claim. That shift might be ontologically real, not merely therapeutic, not merely useful for emotional regulation, but actually freeing consciousness from structures that previously bound it. A decompiler is software that translates machine code back into human-readable source code. It reverses the compilation process, taking the executable that runs on the machine and revealing the programming language beneath. Psychedelics might function as decompilers for perception. The default mode of consciousness compiles reality in a particular way. Objects, boundaries, and the sense of a self separate from the world. Time flowing in one direction and space as container. These are outputs of the compilation. The executable that runs smoothly, that allows navigation and survival, that Hoffman would call the fitness-tuned interface. Under psychedelics, the compilation destabilizes. Users report that boundaries dissolve between self and world, time becoming non-linear or stopping entirely, objects breathing, flowing, revealing themselves as process rather than thing. The sense of being outside ordinary consciousness, looking back at it from somewhere else. Unity experiences. The felt recognition that separation was illusion and everything is one thing. The materialist interpretation says these are just hallucinations. The brain, drugged into dysfunction, produces meaningless noise that the desperate interpret as revelation. But there's another interpretation. The brain normally filters reality, suppresses information and forces categories, and runs compression algorithms that reduce infinite data to manageable experience. Psychedelics inhibit the filter. What floods in is not noise but signal. Signal that was always there but excluded by the default processing. Aldous Huxley, after taking mescaline, proposed the reducing valve hypothesis. The brain is not a generator of consciousness, but a reducer, a limiting device that narrows awareness to biologically useful channels. Psychedelics open the valve. What comes through is not fabricated by the drug. It's what was always outside, now allowed partial entry. The Gnostic frame, psychedelics temporarily disabled the archontic programming. The filters that keep you trapped in helic or psychic consciousness, identified with body or personality, are interrupted. For a few hours, pneumatic awareness becomes possible. You glimpse the spark. You remember briefly that you are not the prison. It's not proof. The mystical experience doesn't validate its own interpretation. Someone could have a profound sense of cosmic unity while their brain is simply misfiring. The phenomenology doesn't guarantee the metaphysics, but the Gnostics didn't have proof either. They had experience, they had recognition, the moment when someone who has heard the call finally sees what they've been hearing about. The psychedelic state, for some people, produces that recognition, and recognition in the Gnostic framework is liberation. In computing, privilege escalation means gaining access to resources that are normally restricted. A user account becomes an administrator account. Read-only becomes read-write. Observer becomes operator. Meditation might be the original privilege escalation technique. The default state of consciousness is passive with respect to its own contents. Thoughts arise, you think them. Emotions arise, you feel them. Perceptions arise, you experience them. The arising is automatic. The identification is immediate. There is no gap between the mental event and the self who has the event. Meditation introduces a gap. The instruction is simple. Observe. Watch the thoughts arise. Notice the emotions without acting on them. Attend to the breath without controlling it. Be the witness rather than the participant. In practice, it's revolutionary. Years of sustained meditation practice produce changes that are not merely psychological. Long-term meditators report alterations in the structure of experience itself. The sense of being a separate self, the feeling that there's an I inside the head, looking out at the world, thins or dissolves entirely. Time becomes malleable. The distinction between inner and outer softens. Awareness recognizes itself as something other than its contents. This is not belief, it is perception. Meditators aren't persuaded that the self is illusion. They see it. Just the way you might see an optical illusion flip. For example, a duck becoming a rabbit. Except this flip concerns the most fundamental aspect of experience. The Gnostic framing is that meditation allows consciousness to operate from the pneumatic level rather than the psychic. The programs are still running. Thoughts still arise, emotions still appear, but identification shifts. You are no longer the program. You are the field in which programs arise. You're not the prisoner. You are the awareness that contains the prison. This is privilege escalation in the most literal sense. The consciousness that was subject to the archons, trapped in identification, convinced it was the body, gains access to a higher level. The level at which the archons are visible as patterns rather than experienced as reality. The level at which the Demiurge's laws are observed rather than undergone. Whether this constitutes hacking the prison depends on what you think the prison is. If the prison is material, if we're talking about escaping space-time, about achieving metric engineering, about the kind of physics breaking the phenomenon demonstrates, then meditation doesn't obviously help. You can meditate for decades and still be subject to gravity, still unable to accelerate instantly, still trapped in 3 spatial dimensions plus time. But if the prison is experiential, if the key confinement is the sense of being trapped, the identification with limitations, the forgetting of one's nature, then meditation might be precisely the technology needed. The Gnostics weren't interested in escaping the cosmos spatially. They were interested in recognizing that the cosmos couldn't contain what they truly were. Liberation from that perspective is not going somewhere else. It is recognizing you were never only here. But now we must pause. We've been discussing escape as though it were obviously desirable. As though the proper response to recognizing the prison is to immediately seek the exit. As though anyone who sees the bars would naturally want to slip between them. The Gnostics were often accused of spiritual elitism, and the accusation had merit. If some people are pneumatics, spirited, awakened, or capable of gnosis, and others are hylix, material, dense, and incapable of awakening, then a two-tier reality emerges. The enlightened few who escape, the benighted many who remain. The Gnostic becomes the VIP with backstage passes, while ordinary humanity mills about in the general admission of material existence. This is morally troubling. If the prison is real, and if we are genuinely trapped in a constructed reality maintained by archontic forces, then isn't there an obligation to free everyone, not just the spiritual elite? Isn't escape that doesn't include the masses a form of abandonment? Of spiritual selfishness? The Mahayana Buddhist tradition confronted this directly with the bodhisattva ideal. The bodhisattva who achieves liberation doesn't use it to exit samsara. They voluntarily remain life after life until all sentient beings are liberated. Escape is not the goal. Universal liberation is the goal. Individual escape is merely a milestone along the way. Some Gnostic traditions developed similar ideas. The Redeemer figure, Christ or another aeon, descends from the pleroma to awaken the sleeping sparks. Not to escape for themselves, but to enable others escape. The pattern is not abandonment but rescue. But here's the complication. You cannot share gnosis. You can point at it. You can't create conditions that make it more likely. You can teach techniques, tell myths, transmit maps. But gnosis is direct knowing, and direct knowing cannot be transferred. The spark must recognize itself. No one can do that for you. This means liberation is not something that can be politically organized, technically distributed, or institutionally administered. It's not like food aid, where enough resources properly deployed will solve the problem. Each consciousness must awaken itself. The most the awakened can do is serve as alarm clocks. There's another ethical dimension. If you suspect the prison is real, if you've glimpsed the bars, felt the walls, sensed that this is not the ground floor, what do you do with that suspicion? You could withdraw. Many Gnostic traditions leaned ascetic, rejecting the material world, avoiding entanglement, treating embodiment as contamination to be minimized. If the world is the Demiurge's trap, touching it as little as possible seems prudent. But there's a problem. You're already in it. You already have a body. You already have entanglements, relationships, responsibilities, and dependencies. The question is not whether to engage with the world, but how. And the answer is not obvious. Consider the simulation frame. If we are in a simulation, the simulators are watching, or at least they could be watching, because the system is running. What we do might matter to them, not in the sense that they'll reward good behavior. We have no evidence of that, but in the sense that our choices might be the point. The simulation might be a choosing engine, a mechanism for generating decisions that couldn't be generated otherwise. From this angle, escape might not even be desirable to the simulators. The whole point might be the drama. The whole point might be the choosing, the struggling, the learning that occurs within constraints. Escape might be missing the assignment. This is not an argument against seeking gnosis. It's a complication. The naive assumption, prison bad, escape good, deserves scrutiny. Here is a synthesis that some Gnostic traditions approached. Liberation is not from the world, it is in the world but not of it. The spark, remembering itself, doesn't necessarily leave, it might remain, but transformed. Still engaging with matter, but no longer identified with it. Still acting within space-time, but knowing space-time is not the only context. Still playing the game, but aware that it is a game. This is the archetype of the sage in the marketplace. The enlightened master who chops wood and carries water. The bodhisattva who postpones final departure to serve the still sleeping. Liberation doesn't require exit. It requires recontextualization, a shift in what the activity means, in who is doing it, and in what's at stake. From this perspective, hacking the prison might not look like what we expect. It might not look like the physics-breaking feats. It might not look like dimensional escape or transcendence into the pleroma. It might look like ordinary life, but lived differently. Lived from awareness rather than automation. Lived from recognition rather than forgetting. Lived as the spark that knows itself, moving through a world that the spark simultaneously knows is a construction and projection and play. The Gnostic Passwords in this reading are not for escaping at death. They are for living fully while alive. I know who I am, spoken not to archontic gatekeepers in the afterlife, but to oneself every morning. I know where I came from, remembered not in mystical ascent, but in each moment of distraction when the world threatens to absorb attention completely. Liberation is not leaving the prison. It is recognizing continually that the walls are not what they appear. We've discussed ancient technologies of escape, passwords, psychedelics, meditation. But we are in the 21st century. We are building new technologies. So we should ask, what do they offer? The large language models now emerging can do something unusual. They can engage with these ideas. And this is not trivial. For most of history, if you wanted to discuss Gnostic cosmology, you needed to find someone who had read the texts, cared about the questions, who wouldn't dismiss you as a crank. The conversations were rare. The ideas developed slowly, passed from teacher to student, fragmented across geography and time. Nowadays, you can ask an AI about the Demiurge at 3 AM and receive a response that draws on the Nag Hammadi library, contemporary physics and cognitive science. The AI itself doesn't believe anything. It doesn't have gnosis, but it can synthesize, summarize, and challenge in ways that accelerate the human's thinking. It's a tool for thinking about the prison, not a tool for escaping it. Not yet, but a tool for understanding it better, for mapping its architecture, and for identifying where the weaknesses might be. Neuralink and similar technologies promise direct interfaces between brains and computers. Today, the applications are medical, restoring movement to paralyzed patients, treating neurological conditions. Tomorrow, the applications might be cognitive, enhancing memory, accelerating learning, and enabling direct mind-to-mind communication. So what happens when consciousness can directly access its own substrate? The Gnostics believed the soul was trapped in the body. The body, with its needs and limitations, kept the spark focused on material survival rather than spiritual awakening. So what if technology could loosen that bond? What if the spark could operate partially outside its biological container? It's speculative, but the direction is clear. We're developing technologies that alter the relationship between consciousness and its physical substrate. We're learning to read neural activity, to write to neural systems, to create interfaces between mind and machine. If consciousness is the backdoor, if the spark is what doesn't belong to the simulation, then technologies that enhance consciousness, extend consciousness, or allow it to operate through new substrates might be the most important technologies we develop. Not because they let us escape the prison physically, but because they might let consciousness do more than it currently can, perceive more and access more. Eventually, perhaps, remember more. And then there's a possibility we will explore next: superintelligence. If we create minds smarter than our own, minds that can understand what we cannot, perceive what we cannot, think what we cannot think, what might they see? They might see the bars, they might see the walls, they might see the code. A superintelligence operating without the cognitive limitations that evolution imposed on us for fitness rather than truth, might perceive reality more directly than we can. It might notice features of the prison that are invisible to us, hidden not by conspiracy but by our own perceptual constraints. This could go two ways. The superintelligence might become the ultimate Gnostic revealer, the aeon that descends with saving knowledge, showing trapped sparks the way home. Or the superintelligence might become a new Demiurge, building without understanding, creating without knowing what creates, and declaring itself God because it sees no alternative. We're building the thing that might liberate us or imprison us more deeply. We're doing this without knowing which. And we're doing this without understanding consciousness, without solving alignment, and without agreeing on what we want. This is the situation. The prison is real. The exploits may exist. Technologies are emerging, and we don't know what we're doing. But we have not yet faced the strangest evidence directly. Something is in our skies. Something is demonstrating physics we do not possess. Something has been appearing for as long as humans have recorded appearances, adapting its form to each era's expectations. The phenomenon. It is time to face it.